The second scripture reading today picks up where the first left off in the first chapter of the book of Ruth, starting with the 6th verse. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughter-in-laws, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." May God's blessing continue to reside in and flow through the experiences of Scripture on this morning. May it guide the meditations of our hearts and the words of my lips. We're starting a new worship series. This series is going to be centering on the legacy of David, King David, not me. Different David. Not my dad either, different David. Not my uncle, different David. Not my brother-in-law, different. You want to know why there's no Davids? If we even had a son, there would be no Davids, because there's like 50 of us running around. But I'm not talking about any of them. This is the legacy of David the king. Now, often when we think of a legacy, we think of, what came after the fact. That's when we start thinking about legacies, what came after the fact. But often when we start telling the story, the narrative of a legacy, we go back a little bit further. We ask some person who we think is important, or we start thinking about someone who has been important in our lives or in the lives of a broader culture and movement. We go back further than when they were doing their stuff. When I grew up and we would tell the story of George Washington, right? George Washington's legacy is really built around his time in the presidency. That's really his major legacy to this country. We can talk about his leadership with the Continental Army and whatnot, but it was his time in the presidency that is his major legacy. But I grew up hearing stories of cherry trees. We go back. We go back to ground our legacies. And that's what we're doing here in this week, because Ruth is a few generations before David. So to understand David's legacy and the power of the legacy, I'm going to argue we need to go back a little bit to better understand what David meant. Because this text and the texts that made David so important were written long after David lived. Much of Scripture as we know it was written down and brought together in the form that we have during the exile, almost 500 years after David. For 500 years, little bits, scraps, psalms here and there floated around. Things would be brought together, but it wouldn't be put together in its story that we have until all that time later. And it was put together in that time because during the exile and in the period after the exile, the people were trying to figure out, who are we? That's why we tell stories, right? Who are we? And a lot of times when someone asks who you are, we start by talking about our parentage and our grandparentage and where we come from and things along those lines. We might talk about where we got an education, where we work, all of these sorts of things that make us up. We go back to help establish going forward. And so the people in exile, as they returned from exile in Babylon, as they went back to Judah and Jerusalem, they were bringing with them, stories. A sense of what it was to be faithful people, Israel. And a lot of those stories centered around when the kingdom was established, and when the kingdom, Israel, was at its greatest. And they pointed to King David. They pointed to King David because King David, we are told, is the one who brings the Ark of the Covenant. King David is the one, we are told, who actually establishes the city of Jerusalem. It was one of the holdout cities when, according to the book of Joshua, the people came into the land. And so David is elevated as this great king. And so when the exiles are returning, they are returning with a story about the greatness of David. And they're returning with an idea, an ideal. We are going to reestablish the greatness of the Davidic king and empire. For God had promised that there would be a king on the throne. And so they're going to come back and make it happen. And it's not all the people that come back. A lot of folks actually stay in Babylon. Babylon is actually quite nice this time of year. And so not everyone came home. But those that came home, they were really on fire. I mean, if you're willing to leave a nice area and come to, let's face it, Jerusalem was a bit of a backwater at that point, to go back to Jerusalem, to cross the desert. Crossing deserts, not my thing. Crossing deserts, to go in and rebuild. You've got to have something in your heart. You have this sense of the legacy of David, and by golly, you're going to make Jerusalem great again, and Judah great again, and you're going to rebuild the temple. And you're going to celebrate the legacy of David the king. There's two books in Scripture that actually go into this quite a bit. Often, actually, in the Hebrew Bible, they're considered a single book, Ezra and Nehemiah. For us, they're separate, Ezra and Nehemiah. And if we were to read Ezra and Nehemiah, we would hear the story of these folks who chose to leave Babylon and go back, who were bringing with them a distilled sense of self and faith. They were bringing with them Scripture, and they were going to go back on a mission to replant the vineyard in Israel. They had spent the time figuring out or wrestling with who are we? And they returned home, according to Ezra and Nehemiah, carrying the flag of, this is who we are. This is what it is to be Jewish culturally, religiously, ethnically. This is what it is to be us. Now, sometimes we go through those sorts of things here. This is a common sort of thing. We choose to leave home, partly because our parents say it's time to go. No. I don't have a basement for my kids to live in, so. But partly also because we need to discover and discern who we are. According to Ezra and Nehemiah, the people come back into the land and they begin rebuilding. They rebuild the city walls. They start rebuilding the temple. They have this prolonged worship service where the people are on the hillside and Scripture is read to them for well over a day, give or take. The legacy of David is being defined And in Ezra and Nehemiah, part of that legacy as it was defined was that if you were not Jewish, culturally, ethnically, religiously, you were sent home. Now, when the people went into exile in Babylon, God spoke through the prophets and said, "Marry, have children, pray for the blessing of Babylon." And people did. But when they returned home, according to Ezra and Nehemiah, if you had a non-Jewish spouse, you had to send them away. If you had non-Jewish children, you had to send them away. Because that was the legacy that they were trying to rebuild, according to Ezra, Nehemiah in Scripture. But then we have this story. Wondering why I was going to get to Ruth, right? When we read it, and I'm talking about everything else. I couldn't have us read everything. But then we have this story. This story of Ruth and her mother-in-law. Her sister-in-law is important as well, Orpah. But Ruth and her mother-in-law. Some stories have ghosts, right? Some legacy stories have ghosts. Some stories have bears in them. All good camp stories have a bear in them in some way, shape, or form. This story has Moab, a place. And Moab as a place is important in this story because this text, telling a story of King David's great-grandparents, is talking about a group of people who are distinctly not Jewish. Ruth is a Moabite. And if we were to read other places in Scripture, if we were to go back to the book of Genesis, we would find that the origin of the Moabites, according to Genesis, is a little racy, more than a little inappropriate, dealing with Lot and one of his daughters. And so the Moabites were considered a less than people in some circles. But this story, this part of David's legacy, centers on Moab. Naomi and her husband, during a great famine, flee their land. They leave Judah, the environs around Bethlehem, and they go to a foreign land for a chance at a better life. Just like Jacob, who is Israel, will do, just like Abraham and Sarah, they will flee. And they take their 2 sons with them, Naomi and her husband do. And they will marry. Because that's what you do. They will marry. Tragic turn in the narrative. Naomi finds herself, along with her 2 non-Jewish daughters-in-law, without the anchoring in a male-driven society, without the anchoring of a male. And then she finds herself, Naomi, back in Judah, with Ruth, the Moabite. This text is being brought into the story, the narrative of the people, at the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah is being put forward. It's a commentary, it's a pushback. When Ezra and Nehemiah are saying we have to be pure Jewish, however we define that, this story comes along from the legacy of David, and they say, well, wait a minute. David wasn't pure Jewish. Ruth and Naomi have returned home. Well, it's at least Naomi's home. And she has to wonder, will she find welcome? Even though this story is set several hundred years before Ezra and Nehemiah, that question, will we find welcome, is important to the people who are receiving the text. If my great-grandparents aren't of the right group, will I be welcome? If my parents aren't of the right group, will I be welcome? If I have a sibling or a spouse who is, for whatever reason, not of the right group, will we be welcome? Will God be accepting of someone who is different? Will God embrace a Moabite? I'm worried about David's legacy here. This is scandalous. A Moabite in the closet. My goodness. This is the kind of stuff that soap operas are made of. Ultimately, Ruth's story is a love story. It's a racy love story, too, just like a good soap opera. It's also a story that does not overtly claim God in many ways, but does recognize God's ever-broadening embrace. It's brought together in Ruth's dramatic statement. Don't press me to leave you. Don't cause me to turn back. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. It's a critique of the narrow descriptions of community that the Ezra-Nehemiah texts are defining. As they attempt to define the legacy of David in a very limited kind of way, Ruth's voice echoes from back and comes forward into David's legacy and tells us that God is bigger than that. God is broader than that. Your God, my God, becomes a way of pushing through the gates and the gatekeepers, pushing past the city walls that Ezra and Nehemiah were looking to rebuild, the boundaries of temple that defined who was allowed to go where as a people of faith. This voice, your God is going to be my God. It is the same God. It's a clarion call. This is a narrative that's offered to a people who are trying to remember and define who they are. And it's the same sort of challenges and themes that reside with us today. Our movement, Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, this nation that we live in, this particular congregation of faith, we are wrestling with this, or at least we should be. We are church today as understood through King David's legacy. For the grounding of Jesus in the Gospels is through the house of David. And the house of David includes a Moabite. This is a legacy that's going to flow through cross and empty tomb. We are church today with an interpreted past, right? We tell the story, we interpret it. We live in a glorious present, whether it feels like it all the time or not. And we are church today in David's legacy with a future that is on a line somewhere between that which we fear the most. Are the wrong kind of people going to get in? Are we not going to be here? And the future that we hope for the most. Your God and my God. And just as it was in the time of the telling of Ruth, we live in a time of rebuilding as well. A time of Christ calling us to reconstruct and reimagine. We live in times of reformation and restoration and restructure. And we can hear that voice from someone who is distinctly other than, crying out, saying, your God, is my God. And we say, yes, God with us. Thanks be to God, and amen.